January 17, 1944. RAF Bottisham, Cambridgeshire. 5:42 hours. The cold is brutal. -15 on the line. Frost creeps like silver veins over the aluminum skin of a P-51B Mustang. Its Merlin engine breathes clouds of steam into the dark, waiting dawn. Beneath the wing, a single man moves with purpose. His name is Staff Sergeant Harold Beckett. Radio maintenance, 355th Fighter Group. He works alone, back bent, hands gloved in oil-stiff leather. The night shift's sodium lamp burns pale against the fog. He opens the access panel, the smell of ozone and glycol rising. Inside, wires glint with frost. One loose connection could mean silence at 40,000 feet. Silence that kills. In a few hours, these fighters will escort the bombers to Brunswick. They'll climb higher than the radios were ever meant to work. Above 35,000 feet, the tubes fail, the voices fade, the net goes dead. But Beckett isn't guessing. He's been chasing this fault for weeks. The static, the frozen filaments, the dead channels. A wrench slips. Blood beads under his nail. He wipes it on his sleeve and listens to the test tone whine alive. The radio hums, strong and clear, a breath of relief. Then, the faint echo of engines starting up across the airfield. And with that sound begins one of the quietest revolutions of the air war. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had become a battle of altitude and endurance. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the low skies, and the Americans, flying deep penetration raids from English fields, were taking the fight to the heart of Germany. But with every new mission, a new ceiling was tested. Bomber streams flew higher to avoid flak. Fighter escorts were forced to follow, clawing into the stratosphere at 35, even 40,000 feet. Up there, everything broke down. Metal grew brittle, oil thickened, guns jammed, oxygen froze in the lines. And for the men of the air, perhaps most dangerously of all, their radios went silent. In theory, every Mustang, Thunderbolt, and Spitfire carried the best radio technology the Allies could field. The RAF had pioneered the TR-443 and later VHF systems. The USAAF adapted the SCR-522, a rugged set that promised clear, static-free communication. On the ground, these radios worked beautifully. At 10,000 feet, they were reliable. But as the fighters climbed into the thin air above 30,000, signal strength dropped, modulation faltered, and filaments inside the vacuum tubes, already glowing at white heat, burned out or cracked from the cold. The result was deadly. Squadrons broke formation when orders were missed. Pilots couldn't call for help when fuel ran low or engines failed. Interceptions dissolved into chaos. "We lost more to silence than bullets," one flight leader later wrote. Commanders blamed pilots at first. Faulty tuning, poor discipline, incorrect channel change. But back on the line, men like Staff Sergeant Harold Beckett knew better. The fault wasn't human. It was electrical. The technology itself was being pushed beyond what its designers imagined. The SCR-522, a 1942 design, relied on fragile vacuum tubes tuned for sea-level density. Above 30,000 feet, the near-vacuum environment changed everything. The tubes arced unpredictably, the dynamotor voltage spiked, and moisture condensed in the wiring harnesses. Inside cramped fuselages, frost formed on contacts that should have been bone dry. A single flake of ice could detune an entire circuit. In England's dispersal bays and canvas hangars, radio mechanics fought this invisible war night after night. They carried meters and soldering irons instead of rifles, but the stakes were identical. A working radio meant a pilot came home. A dead one meant another empty bunk. Most of these men had no rank beyond sergeant. Their workshop was a tent lined with spare parts, their manuals grease-stained, their tools borrowed or improvised. They learned through error, by touch and smell. The faint ozone of a shorted transformer, the click of a relay under strain. And yet, through their persistence, the high-altitude silence slowly began to break. At Bottisham and similar bases across East Anglia, modifications appeared quietly, unofficially. In the margins of the paperwork, ground crews wrapped tubes in improvised insulation. They rerouted harnesses, installed small resistors to stabilize current, and used engine heat ducts to warm the radio bay. None of this was sanctioned by the manuals, but it worked. Beckett's breakthrough was typical of these unsung engineers. He noticed that the SCR-522's transmitter section drifted off frequency after prolonged climb. The cause? Temperature shock on the quartz crystals. His fix was crude but ingenious. A hand-cut aluminum shroud channeling residual warmth from the firewall toward the set's casing. On test flights, the net stayed clean even past 38,000 feet. It was small work in the grand machinery of war, but it mattered. A radio that stayed alive in the stratosphere changed the rhythm of combat. Controllers could redirect squadrons mid-mission, warn of enemy interceptors, or recall damaged fighters before they drifted too far to glide home. For every glowing combat report, there were nights like Beckett's, cold, wordless, endless, where the war was fought with solder instead of bullets. The pilots in their sleek machines never saw the faces of the men who kept their voices alive. But when the call sign came through, "Dog Red, this is Control. Come in loud and clear," the line between life and death had already been redrawn. That morning of January 17th, as the first P-51s lifted from Bottisham, the squadron climbed higher than ever before, and the radios held. What followed would confirm beyond doubt how critical those unseen hands were. Every great air victory of World War II depended not only on the man in the cockpit, but on the vast discipline system behind him. In 1944, an American fighter group was a small city of labor, expertise, and repetition. Each aircraft, each mission, was the product of 100 invisible routines, and none were more precise, more quietly critical, than those that ensured a voice could cross the sky. At RAF Bottisham, the radio section occupied a low brick hut behind the hangars. Windowless, warm, and filled with the hum of power supplies. The air smelled of solder, insulation varnish, and cigarettes. On one wall hung the day's frequency board, 3 chalked columns labeled A, B, and C channels, the lifelines of an entire squadron. The process began hours before takeoff. Each fighter had to be tuned, tested, and certified operational by dawn. Beckett's team, 3 men and a corporal, worked through the night, following a ritual as practiced as loading ammunition or checking fuel pressure. They began with crystal allocation. Each SCR-522 set used 4 preset channels, cut to exact megacycles determined by group communications control. Crystals were fragile, their frequencies drifting with even slight contamination. Mechanics handled them with tweezers, wiping each one with alcohol before seating it under spring clips. Then came modulation checks, using bench oscillators to ensure the pilot's voice would cut through static. If the wave pattern was uneven, they adjusted the bias voltage until the sine curve steadied. Outside, in the freezing dark, line crews followed. One man cranked the generator. Another called into his throat mic, while Beckett listened through a headset. "Check, check, Blue 2. Reading you." The sound was thin but steady. The range test followed. 5 miles, 10, 20. At each increment, signal reports were logged on paper forms that would later vanish into files no one would ever read. This ritual consumed hours, yet was repeated before every mission, because altitude did not forgive shortcuts. Unlike ground-based radios, airborne sets had to endure violent pressure shifts and vibration that loosened every screw, every solder joint. To the untrained eye, the radio was a metal box. To Beckett, it was alive, temperamental, sensitive, capable of betrayal. The radio section's role extended beyond equipment. They formed the backbone of air discipline itself. During mission briefings, the communications officer reviewed procedures, brevity codes, recognition phrases, and radio silence intervals. But those crisp transmissions that filled the sky, the clipped American voices calling bandits, 12 high, or break left, were possible only because the men in the huts had ensured their microphones would not freeze, their sets would not drift, their aerials would not snap in the wind. In the command echelons, the problem was understood but rarely discussed. High command spoke in tonnage of bombs, not in decibels of clarity. Yet quietly, entire research sections sprang up in England and the States to study high-altitude signal attenuation. They discovered that at 40,000 feet, air molecules themselves, fewer, slower, colder, altered the behavior of radio waves. The curvature of the Earth also meant line-of-sight limits. Above 38,000 feet, pilots often flew beyond their own control tower's horizon. The only thing keeping them linked was the discipline of radio relay and the precision of those tuned crystals. Beckett knew none of this theory. He worked by instinct and habit. He trusted his hands, his hearing, and the hum of a good circuit. He could tell a failing tube by its smell, a misaligned frequency by a faint beat in the static. When parts were short, he scavenged. When a new directive arrived from Group SU, recalibrate all sets to new frequencies, effective immediately. He and his men stayed until dawn, resetting every dial. Knowing a single misstep could strand a pilot in enemy airspace without guidance. Their reward was silence. When the squadron launched and the radios worked, no one spoke of them. No medals, no mission credits, no mention in dispatches. But when a voice cut out mid-fight, when a pilot spiraled down screaming into dead air, they were the first summoned for blame. The system worked only because men like Beckett refused to let it fail. He belonged to an army of sergeants who knew that modern war ran not only on courage and fuel, but on connectivity, on the invisible threads of sound stretched across the empty sky. That winter, those threads began to hold. The long-range bombers reached Berlin and back with full escort contact. Air Command noticed the difference in formation survival. The fix was technical, but the impact was strategic. The war in the air was about to tilt, and as the spring of 1944 approached, Beckett's small triumphs in the cold English night would echo far beyond Bottisham, reaching into the heart of every mission that dared climb higher than ever before. The fighter pilots were the face of the air war, the knights of the sky whose photographs filled newspapers and morale posters. But beneath every victory roll, there were men whose names were never spoken over the radio net. They were the quiet ones, the mechanics, the riggers, and most of all, the radio sergeants. For them, war was repetition. Night after night, they worked under blackout lamps, their world lit only by the dull orange glow of vacuum tubes. Their hands bore the cuts of safety wire, their knuckles were permanently bruised. Theirs was not the romance of flight, but the cold monotony of perfection. One mistake, one missed contact, and a squadron could vanish into cloud and silence. Beckett lived by a creed unspoken but absolute. The pilot must never hear his own voice fade. He slept in shifts, ate standing, and measured his success by the absence of complaint. When the fighters returned, their radios still alive after hours above 35,000 feet, he simply noted operational on the form and moved on. War at that level of routine demanded a special kind of courage, patience, precision, and a refusal to accept failure. Men like Beckett never fired a shot in anger, but their endurance, their refusal to let the invisible fail, became one of the unheralded victories of modern warfare. At 40,000 feet, technology itself was at war. the human body barely functioned, and neither did machines designed for Earth's lower air. The radios the Allies relied on. Notably the SCR-522 in American aircraft, and the TR-5043 or TR-1143 in RAF Spitfires, were marvels of 1940s engineering. They used vacuum tubes that required delicate balance between heat and voltage, tuned crystals for frequency stability, and dynamotors that converted the aircraft's 24-volt system into the high voltages those tubes demanded. But vacuum tubes were creatures of atmosphere. At extreme altitude, air pressure dropped so low that internal arcing could occur even in sealed components. The cold, thickened lubricants froze solder joints and condensed moisture across contacts. When aircraft climbed above 30,000 feet, those stresses combined into chaos, drifting frequencies, muffled signals, or complete failure. Engineers on the ground had no official fix. The manuals offered little beyond replace and retest. But Beckett and others like him refused to accept that. They began to experiment. They wrapped tube banks in cloth and foil, rerouting small ducts of engine heat into the radio compartment. They modified the ground straps, reducing static feedback from the fuselage. They added resistors to stabilize current under voltage spikes. None of these adjustments were authorized. All were born of necessity. Each successful modification became a whispered trick passed across airfields, an unofficial brotherhood of technicians fighting a parallel war. The improvement was measurable. Signal reports improved by 10, sometimes 15%. For the first time, formations could maintain contact across the climb from takeoff to combat altitude. By the spring of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces recognized this field innovation and began incorporating some fixes into official maintenance circulars. The unsung hands at Bottisham and Debden had changed the high-altitude communications doctrine without ever leaving the ground. Every fighter engagement depended on seconds. A single garbled message could decide life or death. When radios failed, formations broke. When they worked, entire battles shifted course. In the early months of the European air campaign, escort missions were plagued by fragmentation. P-47s and P-38s often lost contact with their bombers due to radio dropouts at high altitude. Wingmen disappeared into haze, unable to hear orders. German interceptors exploited the confusion, slashing into bomber streams before the escorts could react. Once the VHF sets began to hold clear channels at 38,000 feet and beyond, the tone of the air war changed. Controllers could vector squadrons directly onto approaching fighters. Commanders could redirect escorts mid-air, splitting, merging, or reforming units in response to radar plots. That precision was revolutionary. It allowed Allied air forces to turn reactive defense into coordinated control. The first time a Mustang group maintained crystal-clear comms over Berlin, the combat reports showed it plainly. Formation held tight. Orders received instantly. Result? Sanindad minimal losses. For the pilots, it was liberation. They could finally hear their leaders, their wingmen, and the controllers far below guiding them home through storms or damage. For the first time, the silence at altitude was broken, replaced by a disciplined orchestra of clipped American code words and steady British accents. Behind every syllable was the invisible work of men like Beckett. Solder burns, sleepless nights, improvised fixes, and a faith that their work mattered. The pilots might never know their names, but their victories depended on their silence. And yet, as much as technology and tactics evolved, the true test was still coming. The fusion of leadership, doctrine, and ingenuity that would push communication itself into a new era of warfare. Every revolution in warfare begins not with invention, but with someone who decides to trust it. By 1944, The senior commanders of the Allied air forces faced an invisible crisis. Missions were being lost to silence, and silence, unlike an enemy, could not be bombed or shot down. The problem reached headquarters through sterile phrasing in mission debriefs, radio failure at altitude, loss of contact with lead, formation scattered. Each line concealed the chaos of men separated by static, fighting blind above the clouds. It was men like General Ira C. Eaker and Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory who realized that radio reliability wasn't a side issue. It was strategy. They ordered communications sections expanded, new frequencies cleared, and entire research divisions formed to study the physics of high-altitude transmission. Engineers at Farnborough and Wright Field began working on pressurized radio housings and new insulation materials. But the real change came at the group and squadron level, where leaders began to recognize that a sergeant with a soldering iron could decide the fate of a mission as surely as a colonel in a briefing room. Commanders started visiting the line, asking questions, learning what drift or modulation meant. The divide between air crew and ground crew began to narrow, not through speeches, but through quiet respect earned at dawn, beside a humming set. Leaders began enforcing radio discipline as doctrine. Every pilot had to know brevity codes, channel protocols, and emergency frequencies. Radio silence was no longer superstition, it was tactics. And when that silence broke, it had to break with clarity. By mid-1944, clear communication was treated like ammunition. Carefully measured, precisely delivered. The air war had found its voice, and leadership had finally learned to listen. The Luftwaffe heard those same voices in the sky, and tried to silence them. German engineers were no less brilliant, and by 1943 they understood that communication was the new weapon. They began experimenting with radio jamming, broadcasting white noise or false commands on Allied frequencies. Some of these efforts, like the Karl and Heinrich jammers, were primitive. Others, especially near Cologne and Bremen, were alarmingly effective. Pilots reported hearing phantom voices mid-mission, orders to break formation, to change headings, even to dive. For a time, confusion reigned, but the Allied networks adapted quickly. Ground controllers introduced coded authentication words, changing daily. Pilots learned to recognize the tonal patterns of their own squadrons. The fog of radio war became a battleground of discipline versus deception. Even without jamming, nature itself was an adversary. At extreme altitude, atmospheric ionization distorted VHF waves, creating fading echoes that mimicked interference. The northern European winter made it worse. Pilots could hear ghost transmissions looping back seconds later, confusing commands. The Germans exploited these quirks when they could. Timing attacks during known skip periods, when signals weakened. Beckett's small innovations, stabilizing voltages, warming circuits, didn't just fight the cold. They sharpened clarity against this chaos. A cleaner signal meant fewer echoes, fewer false orders, fewer seconds lost. The line between order and disaster was measured in syllables. When the Allies invaded Normandy, German operators attempted mass jamming again, but by then improved sets, better shielding, and disciplined code brevity had hardened the net. The Luftwaffe could still fight, but they could no longer silence the Allied sky. In war, recognition follows the sound of engines and the flash of guns. No one applauds the man who fixes what others forget. Yet history's weight often rests on such hands. Beckett's generation of radio men embodied a kind of moral endurance, a devotion to precision in the service of lives they would never meet. They fought fatigue, monotony, and indifference. They worked in cold so deep their breath froze inside oxygen masks, and they did it not for glory, but for reliability. There is an ethics to that kind of work. It is the belief that responsibility doesn't end when the job is unseen. For every mission that succeeded, there were 100 details invisible to all but a few. Untold, the torque of a connector, the hum of a tuned crystal, the flicker of a test lamp at 3 a.m. Those details, multiplied by thousands of hands, became victory. When the pilots returned and dropped from their cockpits, they often walked straight past the men who had kept them alive. That wasn't neglect. It was habit. The sergeants didn't expect thanks. The war had trained them to find satisfaction in silence, in knowing that no one had crashed because of their oversight, that no formation had scattered because of their lapse. They would never wear the distinguished flying cross. Their medals were small, their citations routine, but their work had changed the course of air combat. It had transformed chaos into coherence and isolation into unity. At Bottisham, the night before a major raid, Beckett closed the panel of a freshly tuned Mustang and listened to the set crackle to life. "Blue Leader, this is Control. Reading you 5 by 5. 5 by 5. Perfect signal strength and clarity." It was more than a test result. It was the measure of an army that had learned to think in electrons as much as in tactics. The stage was set for a moment of proof. One mission, one climb, one decisive test where technology, leadership, and human endurance would meet the cold reality of combat. February 20th, 1944. It was the beginning of Big Week. Party Mine, Operation Argument, the Allied campaign to cripple German aircraft production through relentless daylight bombing. Every available bomber and fighter in England was to take part, and for the men at RAF Bottisham, it was the day everything they had worked for would face its test. The 355th Fighter Group had been assigned high cover for B-17 formations bound for Leipzig. The route would push Mustangs to their absolute limit, nearly 600 miles round trip, with a cruise altitude brushing 40,000 feet. Even the smallest malfunction could mean death. Dawn crept over the airfield like a dull steel blade. Engines coughed alive, oxygen hissed, mechanics shouted through the cold. Beckett was already at his station, crouched beneath the wing of Miss Kansas, a P-51B assigned to Captain Richard H. Clements, a veteran escort leader known for his calm precision. The radio test began as usual. "Check. Check, Control. This is Dog Red 1. Dog Red 1. Antwertiwantiwa, Gandiafortuti Indiri. Read you 5 by 5, Beckett answered through the static. He logged the reading and gave the thumbs up. Clements nodded from the cockpit, adjusting his oxygen mask. The canopy sealed with a click. The squadron rolled to the runway, tail wheels bouncing lightly in the frost. As the aircraft climbed, Beckett stood by the dispersal hut, headset pressed to his ear, listening to the faint pulse of their transmissions. At 10,000 feet, the voices were crisp. At 25, a touch of distortion. Then, the moment of truth. 35, 38, 39,000 feet. Normally, the signal would fade, break into ghost echoes. Not this time. The net was clean. Every word cut through like glass. Dog Red lead. This is Dog Red 2. Reading you clear over. Copy 2. Maintain spacing. Angels 3-8. Beckett exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the cloudy horizon. Somewhere above that endless gray, the sound of his work was holding the squadron together. The mission itself unfolded across two nations. The Mustangs climbed ahead of the bomber stream, tracing thin contrails through a sky of frozen sunlight. At 40,000 feet, the world turned strange. Colors dulled, sound vanished. Even thought felt distant. Oxygen masks crusted with ice. The pilot's breath formed a thin white film inside the lenses of their goggles. For months, such conditions had killed communications. Voices would distort into whispers or vanish completely. But today, the radios held their tone. The pilots could hear each other. They could coordinate. The bombers streamed below. Waves of B-17s and B-24s glimmered like a moving city in the sky. Each formation depended on its fighter cover to repel German interceptors before they reached the bombers. Just past Hanover, radar operators at Allied command detected movement. Antipretedert, set in flights. Dozens of enemy contacts climbing from airfields around Brunswick and Wernigerode. Me-109Gs and FW-190s racing to intercept. At 11:12 hours, Clements received the call. Dog Red, Vectors 080, Angels 35. Bandits inbound, large formation. He answered instantly. Calm, precise. Copy control. Dog Red, turning east. The order carried down the net like electricity. Every wingman heard it. Every aircraft turned in unison, cutting through the pale sunlight with near-perfect spacing. At that altitude, even the slightest confusion could scatter a squadron. But not today. The formation held like a single organism, responding to a single voice. Minutes later, specks appeared on the horizon, black dots against the silver haze, growing fast. The Luftwaffe was climbing hard, using cloud for cover. The Mustangs dived slightly to meet them, throttles open, guns armed. The first merge happened over the town of Helmstedt. 20 Mustangs against nearly 40 German fighters. The sky erupted into contrails and cannon flashes. The roar of engines was swallowed by the thin air, but on the radio net, voices cut through with surgical clarity. Dog Red lead, tally bandits, 2 o'clock high. Copy 2, break right, break right. Splash 1, I'm clear. The net was alive, not chaotic, not panicked, but coordinated. Pilots passed bearings, confirmed kills, and regrouped in seconds. Clemence's calm voice guided them through. Below, bomber crews listening on their secondary frequencies could hear the fight unfold. They knew they weren't alone. Their escorts were talking. The battle lasted barely 10 minutes. The Luftwaffe formation broke apart under the weight of precision and discipline. Allied guns found their marks. By 11:25, the sky above Brunswick was clear. When the Mustangs rejoined the bombers, every one of Clemence's aircraft was accounted for. Not a single fighter lost. On the ground, hours later, the first transmissions filtered back to Bottisham. Mission complete. Radios perfect throughout. Formation intact. Beckett heard the news without celebration. He simply noted it in the logbook, as always. But he lingered by the receiver, listening to the fading carrier tone that marked the end of the day's mission. He knew what it meant, not in words or medals, but in the silence that followed. That silence, once deadly, was now the sound of success. Yet even victories have layers. Beneath the calm, something profound had shifted. The success of the mission wasn't only a triumph of courage, but a triumph of communication, of the link between machine and man, soldier and signal, trust and voice. And as the war pressed deeper into Europe, this link would face even harsher tests, where altitude, weather, and combat would push the limits of everything the Allies had built. The winter sun was falling low over East Anglia when the Mustangs returned. The sound reached first, a distant hum that grew into a thunder rolling over the airfield. Mechanics dropped tools and turned to watch the formation descend, perfectly spaced, wingtips glinting orange in the dying light. Every aircraft accounted for. When Captain Clements taxied in, Frost still clinging to the spinner, Beckett stood at attention by the dispersal hut. The canopy slid back. The pilot's face was pale, streaked with oxygen mask lines. He lifted his helmet and called down over the noise of the idling Merlin. "Good work on the set, Sergeant." Never dropped a word. For Beckett, that was more than praise. It was confirmation that weeks of effort, sleepless nights, and silent determination had changed something larger than any one mission. The debrief later that evening painted the full picture. The raid on Leipzig had been a success. 78 bombers lost, but hundreds returned intact. Escort coverage was described as unbroken. Radio clarity was listed as excellent throughout climb and engagement. For the first time in the campaign, the 355th Fighter Group had maintained uninterrupted communication above 38,000 feet. For readers, the ceiling where failure used to begin. To the men in operations rooms and command tents, it was a technical note. But to the pilots, it was a revelation. They had experienced something new: coherence in the sky. That coherence meant coordination. Squadrons acting as one, responding instantly to vector calls, regrouping in seconds after combat. The confusion that had plagued earlier missions, the garbled calls, the missed warnings, had vanished. For the first time, command could orchestrate the air war across hundreds of miles in real time. And the implications were immense. The success of that mission didn't stay confined to Bottisham. Reports reached the 8th Air Force Communications Section, where officers examined the maintenance notes and Beckett's hand-drawn sketches of modified shielding and heat shrouds. The solution was brutally simple: a ducted airflow plate and insulation wrap that stabilized the transmitter at extreme altitude. Within weeks, the fix was reproduced across East Anglia. By March 1944, nearly every fighter group in the 8th Air Force had implemented some variation of the Bottisham modification. Signal strength at high altitude improved by an average of 15%. The complaint logs, once filled with "no contact above 35,000, dwindled to near zero. A small change had rewritten operational capability. With that change came transformation on the battlefield. From March to May 1944, Allied escort missions achieved levels of coordination previously unthinkable. Fighter groups rotated cover over bomber streams without loss of contact. Controllers in England could now track and redirect aircraft deep into Germany using relayed radio nets. During Operation Chowhound and Big Week's later phases, the difference was visible even to the enemy. German radar operators, listening on captured frequencies, noted that Allied formations no longer scattered. Their intercept patterns failed more often because the American and British formations held tight, moving with near-mechanical precision, guided by clear voice orders. German ace Adolf Galland would later remark that the Americans had turned the radio into a weapon. It wasn't hyperbole. In the hands of disciplined airmen, communication had become strategy. A force multiplier that bound hundreds of aircraft into a single, intelligent system. And at the center of that transformation was a network of nameless sergeants, men like Beckett, who spent their nights chasing invisible faults through frost and fatigue. They didn't invent new machines. They made existing ones work where they shouldn't have worked at all. Their work turned cold air into connection, distance into control, and noise into unity. The day after the Leipzig raid, Beckett's section received a brief citation, a typed memo from Group Command, Commendation for Technical Efficiency, Radio Section, 355th FG. No failures reported during operational altitude tests exceeding 39,000 feet. Outstanding service under adverse conditions. No names, no ceremony, just ink on a carbon copy. But Beckett pinned it above his workbench, next to a small piece of aluminum sheet, a remnant of the prototype heat shroud that had made it all possible. That night, he walked out onto the airfield. The dispersal area was silent, the sky above perfectly still. He looked up at the faint contrails fading high overhead, ghosts of the day's battle, and felt the cold press against his face. He thought of how, for years, those same skies had been filled with the screams of engines and the static of broken radios. Now they carried voices, calm, steady, human. The war had not been won yet, but something irreversible had shifted. The air war, once plagued by isolation, had become a conversation, one that could stretch across the continent. That change was not the work of generals or designers, but of men who refused to let silence win. And in the long, cold winter of 1944, that refusal had just turned into victory. The success of that mission would ripple outward into doctrine, design, and the very way air forces would operate for decades to come. But the world wouldn't know it yet. The record books would name the aces, the raids, the losses, and victories. The line about radio reliability would be buried in a technical appendix. Yet for those who lived it, for the pilots who survived because they heard a single clear voice in the frozen blue E. It was unforgettable. The forgotten sergeant had done his job, but the war would demand more, and soon. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, communications would become the nervous system of an entire army. The lessons learned in the thin air above Leipzig would soon descend to the beaches of Normandy. The success of that mission would ripple outward, into doctrine, design, and the very way air forces would operate for decades to come. But the world wouldn't know it yet. The record books would name the aces, the raids, the losses, and victories. The line about radio reliability would be buried in a technical appendix. By the spring of 1944, the quiet miracle that began in a frozen dispersal bay at Bottisham had spread across an empire of airfields. What started as an improvised aluminum shroud and a sergeant's stubborn refusal to accept failure had become a blueprint. Passed from one radio hut to another, copied, refined, and adopted until it reached every major fighter group in the European theater. Official orders soon followed. The U.S. Army Air Force's Communications Branch issued Technical Bulletin 0844, a short, utilitarian document that mentioned only recommended modifications to prevent altitude-induced signal loss in VHF transmitters. There was no credit line, no name, but those who worked the benches recognized the pattern diagrams instantly. They were Beckett's. With the fix standardized, an invisible revolution took hold. For the first time, high-altitude communication was no longer an experiment. It was a system, yet for those who lived it, for the pilots who survived because they heard a single clear voice in the frozen blue E. It was unforgettable. The forgotten sergeant had done his job, but the war would demand more, and soon. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, communications would become the nervous system of an entire army. The lessons learned in the thin air above Leipzig would soon descend to the beaches of Normandy. By the spring of 1944, the quiet miracle that began in a frozen dispersal bay at Bottisham had spread across an empire of airfields. What started as an improvised aluminum shroud and a sergeant's stubborn refusal to accept failure had become a blueprint. Passed from one radio hut to another, copied, refined, and adopted until it reached every major fighter group in the European theater. Official orders soon followed. The U.S. Army Air Force's Communications Branch issued Technical Bulletin 0844, a short, utilitarian document that mentioned only recommended modifications to prevent altitude-induced signal loss in VHF transmitters. There was no credit line, no name, but those who worked the benches recognized the pattern diagrams instantly. They were Beckett's. With the fix standardized, an invisible revolution took hold. For the first time, high-altitude communication was no longer an experiment. It was a system. In early April, the 352nd, 357th, and 4th Fighter Groups began reporting unprecedented success in maintaining signal clarity during deep escort missions. Excellent readability throughout climb and engagement became a common note in debriefings. What had once been a daily uncertainty, whether radios would hold above 35,000 TNTs, faded into routine reliability. This new consistency changed not just tactics, but psychology. Pilots who once flew half-blind now carried confidence into combat. The tension of silence, that creeping dread when static swallowed a voice, began to vanish. They could now hear their leaders, their wingmen, and ground control with a clarity that seemed almost unnatural. The air, once an empty and treacherous expanse, felt alive with guidance and reassurance. This shift rippled through command planning. Mission coordinators began scheduling larger formations, trusting that communication could sustain cohesion even across hundreds of miles. Air combat, which had once been fragmented chaos, became orchestration. For the bomber crews, the change was visible. From their gunners' windows, they could see Mustangs and Thunderbolts maneuvering with synchrony that defied chance, diving, rolling, and rejoining in perfect rhythm. It was not just skill. It was connection. But technology never stands still. The success of the SCR 522 modifications led engineers at Wright Field and Collins Radio Laboratories to accelerate work on a new generation of transceivers at a lighter, pressurized, and thermally stabilized for extreme altitudes. The lessons learned from the field fixes became design principles for the post-war world. Even the British Air Ministry took notice. Reports from the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force cited American field modifications yielding notable reliability in VHF operation beyond service specification. Within months, parallel adjustments appeared in Spitfire and Mosquito squadrons. Allied communication, once divided by technical standards and national doctrine, began to converge into a shared system. Meanwhile, Beckett and his men continued their work with the same anonymity that had defined it. Their radio hut remained dim, their hands stained with solder, their days measured in test tones and signal reports. They did not know their improvisation had altered the course of an air campaign. Occasionally, a visiting officer would appear, clipboard in hand, making notes, taking photographs of the setup. They called it a case study. To the sergeants, it was just another night's labor. Still, something subtle had changed. Pilots now stopped by the hut before missions, not to complain, but to thank them. "Whatever you did, it's working," one said with a grin. Beckett only nodded. Praise didn't matter. What mattered was the sound, that clear, unwavering voice over the air. Proof that his small act of persistence had reached the edge of the stratosphere. As the summer approached, England's skies filled with preparation for the invasion of Normandy. Every radio operator, every technician, every lineman was drawn into the great synchronization that would define D-Day. Après tout point, a command network so vast that failure was unthinkable. And buried within that network, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and scale, was the legacy of men like Beckett. Men who had proven, in silence, that connection was victory. The air war had evolved. The static had been conquered. But its consequences, both technical and human, were only beginning to unfold. Victory has many fathers, the saying goes, but in war, the quiet ones rarely speak for themselves. When the Allied armies crossed the Channel on June 6, 1944, their success depended not only on courage and strategy, but on something invisible: the seamless flow of communication across thousands of aircraft, ships, and vehicles. Every coded order, every vector call, every Roger out echoed the lessons first proven in the high skies above Germany months before. The network that guided Operation Overlord, from the Pathfinder paratroopers to the beachhead air cover, was built on reliability, and reliability was born of persistence. the work of thousands of anonymous sergeants who refused to let their radios fail. Beckett's field modifications, once improvised in the cold of Bottisham, had become standard across the Allied air fleets. His direct legacy, however, would never carry his name. In the weeks following D-Day, the Air Force began decommissioning older SCR-522 units, replacing them with improved models designed using the very same heat regulation and shielding concepts pioneered in the field. The official reports listed lessons learned from combat application, but made no mention of their source. History absorbed the innovation, but forgot the innovator. After the war, men like Beckett returned home to quiet towns, carrying the invisible weight of the war they had helped win. No parades awaited the radio section. Their contribution didn't fit on posters or in films. They weren't the faces of victory. They were its backbone. In the decades that followed, aviation historians would chart the evolution of aircraft design, tactics, and radar. Few would write of the nights spent soldering circuits in freezing huts, of men working by the sound of static to keep distant voices alive, and yet the lineage of their work persisted in every cockpit that followed. The first jet aircraft of the late 1940s, the P-80 Shooting Star, the Meteor, the Sabre, all flew with radios built on the foundation Beckett's generation had proven. The move from analog valves to transistors, from VHF to UHF, from single channels to frequency-hopping systems, every advance began with the wartime truth that communication was survival. And that truth had been written in sweat, frost, and the faint hum of a working circuit at 40,000 feet. In later years, the 355th Fighter Group's archives preserved only fragments of Beckett's presence, his signature on maintenance sheets, his initials on a modified wiring diagram, a few brief commendations typed on yellowed paper. But among those who served, his kind was never forgotten. Pilots remembered the nights when they found their aircraft warm and ready, radios tuned, frequencies exact. They might not have known the man's name, but they remembered the miracle of hearing a voice cut through chaos when they needed it most. For those who study war, it's tempting to measure heroism in victories. In missions flown, enemies defeated, medals earned. But the deeper measure lies elsewhere. It lives in the constancy of men who held the fragile systems of modern warfare together, who found meaning not in glory, but in precision. In the end, Beckett's war was not about battles won, but about silence defeated, the silence of dead radios, the silence of unspoken names, the silence that separates the known from the forgotten. That winter morning in January 1944, when frost crept across the wings of a P-51 and a lone sergeant refused to surrender to static, he unknowingly changed how the world would fight, fly, and communicate. History may never carve his name in stone. But every pilot who called loud and clear in the decades that followed was, in some way, speaking through his work. The war moved on. The technology evolved. The world forgot. But somewhere in the archives of an airfield long abandoned, a logbook still rests, its ink faded, its edges brittle. With one quiet line written in a sergeant's careful hand, radio operational at 40,000 feet, signal strength 5 by 5. And in that single line lives the echo of all the forgotten hands that made victory possible. History often remembers the thunder, the engines, the gunfire, the victories that shake the earth. But in truth, wars are held together by whispers, by the quiet pulse of a signal across empty sky, by the hum of a working machine that connects one human to another when all else fails. The story of Staff Sergeant Harold Beckett, or of any of the countless men like him, is not about invention or glory. It is about stewardship. A war fought not with bullets, but with precision, patience, and a stubborn belief that failure was unacceptable. In a world collapsing under chaos, he built order from static. His hands never fired a weapon. His name never appeared in headlines. Yet his work changed everything, not just for one mission or one unit, but for the very language of warfare. In the thin blue air above Europe, where oxygen froze and sound itself seemed to vanish, he proved that clarity could endure. That communication could triumph over the cold silence of distance. From that foundation, a new age was born. The principles he embodied, reliability, discipline, ingenuity, became the DNA of modern flight. Every radio check, every control tower call, every calm, "You're clear to land" in today's sky carries a fragment of that legacy. And though time has erased his name from most records, the consequence of his labor lives on in every pilot's headset, every satellite uplink, every whisper between Earth and orbit. His story is the story of the unseen, of all who kept the fragile machinery of progress alive through faith in their craft. In the end, the forgotten sergeant's triumph wasn't in a medal or a memory. It was in the simple, enduring truth that connection saves lives, that even in the loneliest reaches of war, a voice carried faithfully through the void could mean survival. Some heroes roar into history, others hum quietly beneath it, and sometimes that hum, steady, unseen, eternal, is the sound of victory itself.